Baudrillard is a controversial and provocative thinker whose theory of postmodernity is uniquely cynical and hopeless. Any characterization of his philosophy must begin with certain distinctions between the many stages in his thought. Focusing near the beginning of his career, starting in the late 60s, Baudrillard attempted to combine Marxism with structuralism. Structuralism began as a way of understanding language. It basically posited that words, signs, and symbols gain their meaning not from their positive content, but rather how they differ from other words, symbols, and signs. Imagine, for example, that you're trying to learn a new language, one without any connection to any of the languages you already know. Your language teacher, trying to teach you a new word, points to the tree and says X. Now, you might intuitively assume that X means tree in this language, but that's not so clear. Does X refer to all trees or this specific type of tree? Or does it perhaps refer only to the tree bark? Or does it include the branches, roots, and leaves? Perhaps X refers to all plants or nature as a whole. The point is, with only this one reference to go by, we have no way of knowing. We can only find out what the meaning of X is by learning other words and finding out how X differs from these other words. So to understand the word tree, we can't just point out a tree. We must learn how this word differs from the words leaves, bushes, plants, and oaks. In structuralism, the entirety of languages forms such a system where words receive their meaning only by differing from other words. Baudrillard applied structuralism to commodities in post-industrial societies. In such societies, commodities begin to gain their value not from their positive content, not from how useful they are, but how they differ from other commodities through which they establish prestige or appearance of luxury. Take, for example, Kanye West's clothing line. These seemingly regular t-shirts cost $120 each. This is not because of their inherent value. It is not because the material is particularly durable, or because the design is particularly intricate or difficult to reproduce. Rather, it is because the brand name differentiates its t-shirt from cheaper t-shirts and assigns it a sense of prestige and status. It places this commodity at the top of the hierarchy of objects. To understand Baudrillard's theory, we must quickly go over how Marx differentiated between the three types of values. First, there is value with a capital V, which is the value which commodities gain from the labor put into manufacturing. This connects with the labor theory of value, exchange value, which is the price of something on a market where that commodity is worth whatever someone is willing to pay for it. And lastly, use value, which is how useful a commodity is, connecting to economic concepts such as diminishing marginal utility and elastic versus inelastic demand. To these three values, Baudrillard adds a fourth, sign value, the value commodities gain from differentiating themselves in a system of objects representing luxury and status. In traditional Marxism, this notion of sign value would simply be a part of a commodity's use value. But in the late 70s, Baudrillard began to believe that in post-industrial societies, sign value rises above all other types of value and becomes a determining factor of what is valued. And this is what characterizes the postmodern condition, the rule of signs over everything else. This was Baudrillard's final break with Marxism, coming to a peak with the publishing of his most famous book, Simulacra and Simulation, in 1981, the same decade that Don DeLillo wrote White Noise, and the same decade in which the events of the novel takes place.
So in this presentation, we're basically going to argue that almost every plot element and the very structure of White Noise itself manifests Baudrillard's theory that reality has been substituted with signs of the real. And we hope to show this by analyzing conflicts in the novel on both the society-wide and individual levels before identifying the root cause of these problems and how this defines the postmodern condition we see in Jack. So to start off, the first significant portrayal of the postmodern condition in the novel is Jack and Murray's visit to the most photographed barn in America. Having counted more than 5 signs before reaching the site, Murray says, quote, once you've seen the signs about the barn, it becomes impossible to see the barn. Every photograph reinforces the aura, an accumulation of nameless energies, end quote. Now, before ever even seeing the barn, the tourists that Murray is describing are subconsciously primed into thinking of the barn as something of extreme value and uniquely worthy of photographing. By planting these social expectations into their heads as dogma with no further justification through these signs, they're denied the opportunity to experience the barn for what it truly is and react in a truly natural, honest, and unbiased way. As the tourists crowd around with their cameras, tripods, telephoto lenses, and other technology, the actual barn disappears into the cameras and onto the postcards. Just like Baudrillard's theory, the original experience of the barn is lost within its representations. And we see something similar at the airport when Jack arrives to pick up his daughter after her plane nearly crashes. As passengers file out from the near-death experience, they gather around a storyteller and listen to his account of the crash landing in a strange way, quoting the book. They were content to let the man speak on their behalf. No one disputed his account or tried to add individual testimony. They were interested in what he said, but also clearly detached. They trusted him to tell. They trusted him to tell them what they'd said and felt. Now, and that ends the quote. What's actually happening is that the passengers needed an affirmation of their experience, and this was only possible by hearing it told to themselves from an external figure of authority. This is further supported by the fact that the lack of any media attention almost seems to erase the experience itself because of the lack of any external authority. And this is evidenced by Jack's daughter saying they went through all that for nothing. And our final example on this society-wide level is the first stages of the toxic event that takes place in the middle of the book. When the radio warns them of various symptoms such as skin irritation and sweaty palms, and soon afterwards, Jack's children are complaining of these symptoms. Over the course of the day, as the radio updates these symptoms, his children update theirs as well. This connection between the radio and reality further blurs the lines between what is genuine and what is fabricated. We can't deny the reality of their experience in sweaty palms. Of course, by the descriptions of the book, Jack's daughters are actually experiencing these things. But it's unclear whether the girls are suffering as a result of the iodine derivative exposure, or whether their bodies are unconsciously reacting to the radio reports that detail potential symptoms. However, what's important to note is that whichever ends up being the case, whether the girls have been affected by the real thing or just the report of the real thing, the fact remains that their palms are actually sweating. The situation seems to suggest that the difference between reality and the simulated might not be so distinct after all. And to add on to that, deja vu being reported as a symptom as exposure to the toxic chemical initially seems absurd on face value, but symbolically, the phenomenon of actually experiencing deja vu speaks to the essential anxieties expressed in the novel. And these anxieties being between the erasure of the real and the simulated. Of course, deja vu is the sudden feeling that a never before experienced situation has actually occurred previously. But digging deeper into the mechanisms behind this, we can see how memory is kind of a replicating force that copies events and objects and reproduces them as chunks of sensory information in our minds. However, deja vu creates false memories or simulations that possibly have no origin. Deja vu fools us into mistaking illusions for reality, which is very similar to the postmodern condition, obviously. And in the world of white noise, where things can be endlessly copied because they have lost all inner content and value in favor of their sign value, distinguishing what is authentic, genuine, and original seems impossible and pointless. In addition, in the post-airborne toxic event world, whereas before we were just discussing the actual event, now we're moving beyond that, the company Simuvac has gone from using the real event as preparation for a simulated event to simulating a simulation. The Simuvac coordinator, Murray Susskind, actually reprimands people who question his simulation by saying, quote, reality should not interfere with the course of the simulation, end quote, which suggests that artificial appearances at this point have become more important than reality. In the midst of the genuinely an actual disaster, Murray even tries to pay someone to start choking so that he may experience the feeling of saving someone else's life. For Susskind, it doesn't matter that the event is staged, as long as the experience seems real. In his eyes, the feeling of reality and the sense of importance are just as significant and powerful as anything else. However, we can also zoom in on specific characters to offer a deeper understanding of how characters manipulate surface images in order to construct their identities, effectively perceiving themselves through others. Or as Jack as Jack describes himself at the end of chapter 5, I believe, I am the false character that follows the name around, end quote. So just two minor characters throughout the book. Jack notes how Babbitt's tousled hair, and overall untidy appearance actually makes her seem very dignified, as if she has better things to do than tend to her looks and her clothing. She's signaling dignity by simulating or by artificially constructing her looks. Jack also suspects that Murray intentionally um, dresses in corduroy because it's a fabric associated with seriousness and higher learning. So he's signaling his prestige and dignity through the fabric that he wears. And naturally, since Jack is the main character in the story and the story is told from his perspective, Jack's fake identity is actually explored the most. We see how he not only recognizes the artificial identities of those around him, like Babbitt and Murray, but he himself also alters many aspects of his appearance to present the illusion of having more depth and heft. And this is more. This offers more nuance because we actually see him do this himself from his own perspective. So, like on the Chancellor's recommendation, he adds an initial to his name and begins to wear heavy glasses, and the image becomes part of his persona, but it remains kind of dissociated from him. And Jack begins to feel that the name Jack Gladney, or J.A.K. Gladney with the extra initial, is somehow more real than he is himself. And this is where that quote, "I am the false character that follows the name around," comes from. It's right after this description in the book. The reason that he does this is that the subject of his academic study is Hitler, and it has been ever since the beginning of his career. And Hitler is obviously a hugely significant figure, and Jack feels like he must be a more impressive character himself to match his subject. He has this standard that he needs to hold himself to, this external standard. But Jack's insecurities actually go much deeper than that, and this is why we're exploring Jack the most. Jack also seeks safety and security from death, which we'll cover at the end of the section, and he finds these things in German culture's emphasis on strength and in the towering monumental figure of Adolf Hitler, which he almost wraps him around himself like a metaphorical protective cloak. And one interesting nuance is the fact that Jack, despite being an expert in Hitler studies, can't actually speak German, which presents a really embarrassing contradiction to his otherwise carefully constructed and dignified academic persona. Of course, a good understanding of German language would be really important in order to truly study the historical documents and records of things like concentration camps in Nazi Germany, but the fact that Jack lacks this skill further demonstrates Jack's interest in the cultural myths that surround Hitler in Jack's English-speaking world, rather than the historical figure himself. Now, although the above instances are like symptoms of a broad problem in the novel society, a loss of the ability to directly and subjectively perceive reality, that's the fundamental problem. Many of the more subtle background events in the book reveal the success of media and consumer capitalism in manipulating Jack's subjectivity. Multiple times throughout his narration, we see intrusive thoughts in the form of random names of brands, such as, and this is quoting from random parts of the book, the Airport Marriott, the Sheraton Inn, MasterCard, Visa, American Express, Krylon, Rust-Oleum, Red Devil, end quote. And this is just some examples among many, many others, almost in every single chapter. And it's important to note that these invasions of his subjectivity are almost always preceded by contemplations of death, as if the sign value of brands and commodities have the ability to save him from his greatest fear of death. And this actually ends up getting so bad that even when his daughter sleeps, she repeatedly whispers Toyota Celica, and while awake, she lip syncs words from the television. All of the characters in White Noise think and act like they helplessly live in a dystopian world ruled by media, corporations, science, and technology. Although in reality their bodies and minds are perfectly capable of giving them a living experience, their surroundings have corrupted their subjectivity and made them slaves to the zeitgeist of the modern era, or the external standards of the modern era. They live in a completely artificial state, like puppets controlled by the strings of media and consumerism. The quote-unquote reality around them is no longer what they see or feel, but what they are told externally. As Jack laments, quote, "Science has reduced everything we say, do, and feel to the number of molecules in a certain region of the brain," end quote. And this kind of communicates how when we reduce ourselves to cells and molecules, our emotions become meaningless terms, and we are reduced to the mere sum of our chemical impulses. And we see this in the drug Dilar, which comes from the same realm of technological advances like niodine derivative and Simivac, which serves to reduce the entire human experience to chemical reactions in the brain. The drug's claim to eliminate the fear of death seems absurd on face value, but in the world of White Noise, where drugs can regulate nearly every emotion, where human beings are no more than the sum of than the sum total of their data, it's a perfectly logical conclusion for most people. And even worse, there's actually little opportunity for self-correction since the data about the mind and since the data about the mind and body supersede the actual body and mind themselves. In other words, the entire framework of truth has been ruined. This perversion of the role of technology in human society represents a frightening dehumanization that inevitably isolates the individual, which we see in Jack's attempts to cope with the postmodern world ruled by science. Jack is slightly aware of the fakeness of his world, and not enough to break out yet, but just enough to develop a very deep insecurity and an overall fear of death. One of the quotes that really stood out to us was Murray saying, quote, "Death has entered. It is inside you. You are said to be dying, and yet are separate from the dying, can ponder it at your own leisure, literally see it on the X-ray photograph or computer screen, the horrible alien logic of it all. It is when death is rendered graphically, is televised, so to speak, that you sense an eerie separation between your condition and yourself. A network of symbols has been introduced, an entire awesome technology wrestled from the gods. It makes you feel like a stranger in your own dying." End quote. This fear of ultimate inevitability comes from Jack's generalized avoidance of plots, which can be thought of as the stress that comes from a lack of control over his life. At one point, Jack surprises himself when he makes the comment, "All plots tend towards death," in passing. But this saying, "all plots tend towards death," becomes a driving force in White Noise throughout the novel. On the one hand, plots, schemes, secrets, and conspiracies are all essential to the story and the world. For example, every single time we return to the supermarket, Murray makes some allusion to his belief, his conspiracy, that one can find the secrets of reality in the white noise of the supermarket and popular culture. Jack also notes that all of his former wives were secretive and involved in espionage and foreign intelligence, like the CIA and FBI. And this is actually what draws him to Babbitt, who is the opposite, open, honest, and wholesome, which he explicitly finds comfort in. Put simply, in marrying Babbitt, Jack has chosen to reject plots in favor of a more plain life. But going back to his comment that all plots tend towards death, we can see how his rejection of his plotting ex-wives and embracing an open life with Babbitt is Jack's attempt at pushing away death itself, which is his greatest fear. But we can also analyze the idea of plots in a literal sense if we step back a bit, where if we think of plots as the actual literary technique that give a story momentum to advance meaningfully and eventually reach a satisfying conclusion. However, when it comes to human lives, there's only one actual conclusion, which is death. The more momentum Jack's life gains, or the more heavily quote unquote plotted the action of his life becomes, the faster he speeds towards his greatest fear, which is death. And this is why, at the end of the graveyard scene, Jack says, quote, "May the days be aimless, let the seasons drift. Do not advance the action according to a plan," unquote. And for everything we've covered so far, White Noise lacks any conventional sense of plot. Like so far throughout the book, White Noise hasn't really had a defined plot. If anything, the narrative actively resists forming itself into a plot as the story circles and goes off in tangents with no clear direction, almost like ambling around the point. And in a very meta sense, similar to The City of Glass, Jack's fear of dying is actively keeping the novel from settling into a logical plot structure. Since he's the one who controls the narrative, he can seemingly alter reality however he wants. In this way, constructing an aimless sense of plot becomes a defense against death. But as we'll cover in the next section, the problem with this approach to life is that reality has the power to break simulations in some cases, and since death is the most powerful reality, Jack can't keep up this defense forever.
Since the beginning of the novel, we've seen Jack carry this facade, one that's so structured and calm, yet contradicts with his true chaotic and over-worrying self. This, as we know, is due to his fear of death and his attempt to escape it. At the last part of the novel, this interpretation of death slowly alters as we see Jack prepare, self-reflect, and even accept the notion that life cycles. It is only then do we see a false identity crumble and a true one reveal. Through DeLillo's series of events, we closely analyze who Jack was, how Jack transitions, and who he is now. In this section, we will see how Jack breaks free. Jack becomes desperate for control. As we've seen a lot in the novel, he's definitely tried to escape this fear of death and try to and try to find a couple of coping mechanisms to alleviate that fear. Only when those coping mechanisms aren't as reliable as he used to think they were, his perspective starts to shift. One example of this is the revelation of Babette's infidelity, and the secrecy simply steals the comfort he found in their once honest relationship. Another example, and one that's overlooked, is when he suffers a setback when he learns from Howard the Lump that the Egyptian Book of the Dead was a bestseller in Germany. This kind of alters his perspective because he's always valued German culture as a sign of forthrightness, strength, and power, as evidenced by his arrangement with Hitler studies. So the notion that a book about being vulnerable enough to accept death is strange and contradictory to him. And these examples start to begin to affect his confidence and reasoning, causing him to be even more uncertain and insecure than ever. When he cancels his German lessons after his conversation with Murray, he not only abandons his fate in German as a shield or bolster, but he also shows how susceptible he becomes to rumors and misinformation. We also see this in his ability to refute Denise's childish argument about mountains being more concentrated upstate, as it shows that he's losing that intellectual confidence and losing the certainty he once had. Although he feels that his insecurity and feelings are being singled out by death, Jack still continues to seek alleviation wherever he can, which bolsters the argument from the previous section about constructed realities being Jack's coping mechanism. First, running after Winnie Richards and from eating a ton of junk food are two physical acts that offer relief from his mental troubles by preoccupying himself with a different kind of stress, some that we all relate to as we quote-unquote stress eat during those times. Second, being Jack's obsession with Mr. Gray, the man who Babette cheated on Jack with in order to get DeLillo's, is much linked to his fear of dying as it is to his basic instinct for revenge. That is, by indulging in one, he can limit the burden of the other on his mind. Third, the action of paying the bills, with the authority of its meticulously detailed instructions while Jack describes for paragraphs upon paragraphs, provides another for Jack to cope with his fears and anxieties by asserting some control over his increasingly disorienting life. This is strikingly similar to the senior citizens who take Babette's posture and eating and drinking classes hope to assert some control over their aging, weakening bodies. The plot accelerates out of control. Vernon Dickey, Babette's father, briefly lives in Jack's home for a while, but the chaotic and random nature of the visit serves to accelerate the plot of Jack's story in a way that forces him to change. Vernon gives Jack a loaded gun, but without giving Jack any specific reasons to be afraid. Vernon describes the various kind of threats that face a family man in the modern world. The introduction of a loaded gun into this part of the plot calls to mind Russian playwright Anton Chekhov's famous rule about dramatic structures, where a loaded gun hung on the wall during the first act of the play must and will be fired by the third act. In this way, the gun sort of becomes a narrative instigator, or a type of catalyst that triggers the rest of the plot. And just to support this interpretation, the gun is actually fired by the end of the plot, further proving Jack's theory that all plots lead deathward. However, it remains unclear whether Jack merely gets caught up in a larger and inevitable plot hurtling towards violence, or whether he himself creates the fatal plot. This is a callback to how Denise and Stephanie were experiencing symptoms of iodine D exposure based on radio reports they overheard, where in both situations seemingly uncontrollable events are actually the characters unconsciously acting according to their own suggestions. Vernon also serves as a character foil for Jack, and more broadly, Vernon's character is a bit of evidence that Baudrillard's postmodern condition that can be overcome. Vernon is physical rather than intellectual. He works with his hands and is capable of making spur-of-the-moment decisions. But more importantly, Vernon seems unwilling to even entertain the fear of death. Instead, he looks death in the face without flinching. In this calm, stoic appearance of this condition, Vernon also contrasts with the other elderly people in White Noise, who are constantly mumbling and anxiously worrying, but never manage to express themselves as individuals. As a result of this increase in pressure, Jack increasingly prepares and braces for death. He is still unwilling to face death directly, but he continues to seek meaning and connections to his life. Previously, Jack took comfort in the pleasures of the material, consumerist world that we live in, as buying commodities and being intimate with Babette. But now he sees the products and the consumerism behind it, and he views the mortality in all the products that fills his life, literally consuming him. So he begins to throw them away, as if this shedding might also relieve him of the burden of mortality. At this point of the novel, it actually begins to move forward, moving towards an ending as the seasons change and the academic school year come to a close, and a clearly plotted portion of the novel begins to take firm shape. This also foreshadows death, with the initial arrival of affluent, fresh-faced students being reversed with their graduation and leaving campus. After Murray provides the first counter-argument at Jack's belief that all plots tend towards death, we get the sense that death is suddenly not only plausible, but necessary. And this is where we get to the end of White Noise, which ironically is where the traditional conflicts begin. Jack confronts the creator of DeLillo's and the man who Babette had an affair with, Mink, and the gun goes off as it must. However, the plan and the plot that Jack so carefully mapped out goes haywire. This is because Willie Mink, half out of his mind and already ruined, is such a pathetic figure as he fails to become even a decent enemy for Jack. When Jack finds him, he's glued to a soundless television and dressed sloppily. We must find that Mink has absorbed so much meaningless, artificial information from the TV that he now repeats ads and fragments of the show as if he were the TV. And we see a nightmare of the worst possible manifestation of Baudrillard's postmodern condition, where no actual radio or television is necessary to create the white noise that haunts the book. Mink is producing and repeating it himself. He's physically embodying white noise, as if white noise represents death. And if that was the case, Mink is indeed Jack's enemy. Mink's complete inability to differentiate between words from the television and the things they represent in reality reflects the blurring of the real and artificial that has characterized the all-powerful sign value prevalent throughout the novel. For Mink, no difference exists between the two. The physical experience of something and the idea of the thing are one and the same. But at the same time, this entire process is the first time Jack finally takes a real, meaningful step forwards by virtue of accepting that he has a plot, and it's not bad. As he has always said and known, plots inevitably lead towards death. Over the course of the week, he reminds himself of his plan to kill Mink as often as he can, although with almost every reminder, the details slightly alter. He needs the reassurance of having a plan because his definitive course of action gives him the energy, the courage, the confidence that he's lost in this beginning, yet the plan weakens long before it actually fails. He stumbles over details, makes excuses, and even changes the course of these events, where he places the gun in Mink's hand after only using 2 of the 3 bullets. We know that he'll be a shot even before Mink pulls the trigger. The plot that's been so neatly organized has finally failed. To kill Mink is to metaphorically kill death, or at least Jack's fear of it, which he has been longing for since the beginning of this novel. But once Jack is shot and in terrible pain, closer to death than ever before, he realizes that he can't just let Mink die. Ultimately, the problem with Jack's plan and the entire postmodern worldview is that he fails to see the humanity in himself and those around him due to the white noise around him. He realizes that in saving Mink, he feels redeemed and more alive than ever. And without death, such a feeling would have never been possible. At the very end of the novel, the atheist German nuns who treat Jack and Mink provide a sense of closure for Jack. Sister Marie has no comfort or answer for Jack's questions about the meaning of life, except to tell him that appearances and illusions are sometimes necessary. Think of the saying, ignorance is bliss, is essentially what Sister Marie is preaching when she argues that even a false faith serves a purpose, and seemingly as if to prove this point, she says something in German that Jack can't understand. But that's the point. He finds something beautiful in these incomprehensible noises, something that he really can't understand, hence the saying. And on that note, he leaves. At the end of this encounter, the dreaded noise of the German language that used to terrify him has transformed into something beautiful. And Mink, the embodiment of Jack's fears, lies recovering in the hospital room. The simple message of this is that life is difficult, chaotic, messy. Sometimes it seems meaningless, and that there are no easy answers or resolutions. But despite it being inevitable, life need not be terrible as a result. As a nice note to end the story, Whittler's heroic and absurd bicycle ride across the highway proves that life can move on even in the face of death. And the sunset he's moving towards is still beautiful, meaningless, mysterious, yet sublime.